It's ironic that Christians called the Emperor Julian apostate because Julian himself considered Christians to be apostates from their own traditions as well as from Judaism. We'll never know exactly why Julian came to view Christianity as a disease. To be sure, the man who killed his family was a Christian emperor. And Julian had inside knowledge of how awful Christians could be to each other. But Julian always assumed that the disease could be healed. And so, despite his supreme power, he never persecuted the Christians for their faith. He never stopped them from assembling or from practicing their religion in any way. The Christian historian Sodsdeman describes Julian's policy as follows, quote, "Instead of employing fire and sword against Christians, and instead of casting them into the sea or burying them alive in order to compel them to renounce their views, he had recourse to argument and persuasion, and sought by these means to bring them over to the Hellenic way of life. He abandoned all violent measures and manifested unexpected benevolence." I'm Dr. David Litwa, and if you support free evidence-based content, I hope that you will subscribe to this channel, check out my published books, and join my online school, the Gnosis Academy, where you'll find a host of courses in the fields of Gnostic and Hermetic studies, the New Testament, and early Christianity. If you want summaries of scholarly literature, you can sign up for free on my website, the Gnostic Archive. All the links are in the description. According to the Emperor Julian's own words, quote, "I have behaved to all the Galileans," that is, Christians, "with such kindness and benevolence that none of them has suffered violence anywhere, or been dragged into a temple, or threatened into anything else of the sort against their own will." In fact, Julian blessed and benefited Christians who had been banished on account of their religious views. He called them all back and restored their property, which the previous Christian emperor had confiscated. He charged all people not to commit any act of injustice against the Christians, not to insult them, and not to constrain them to sacrifice. When Julian himself was sacrificing in the Temple of Fortune at Constantinople, a local blind bishop walked up to him and publicly rebuked the emperor as an irreligious man, an atheist, and an apostate. Julian said nothing in reply apart from pointing out that Christ didn't heal the bishop from his blindness. The bishop replied, "I thank God for my blindness, since it prevents me from beholding one who has apostatized from religion." But Julian passed on without giving a reply. That was his character. He considered that Hellenism would be advanced by showing leniency and mildness toward Christians. And there's another story that illustrates Julian's character, this one told by the Christian writer Theodoret. Theodoret says that a local official in Berea of Syria disinherited his son when he converted from Christianity to Hellenic piety. The son traveled to the emperor in Antioch and explained his desperate plight. The emperor invited the leading men of the city, including the father, to a banquet. He sat the father and the son on the same dining couch as himself, an extraordinary honor, to say the least. As they were eating, the emperor said to the father, "It doesn't seem just to force the inclinations of anyone. Do not constrain your son, but allow him to adopt whatever teachings he wants." "I don't compel you," said Julian, "to follow my religion, although I easily could." The father replied, "Do you speak to me, emperor, in favor of a wicked and impious creature who has preferred falsehood to truth?" But the emperor, with a gentle expression, interrupted him, saying, I beg you to desist from all invectives." Then he turned toward the youth and said, "I shall myself take care of you, since I cannot persuade your father to do so." Julian thought that Christianity was a disease of the soul. Accordingly, it could not be removed by surgery or cauterization. It had to be healed with the more gentle medicine of persuasion. As Julian wrote in his 41st epistle, it is by reason that we ought to persuade and to instruct people, not by blows or by insults or physical violence. Julian's own best attempt to persuade the Christians was a long tract called Against the Galileans. Galileans was Julian's term for Christians. Christians themselves like to refer to themselves as Catholics, which in Greek means universalists. But Julian highlighted what many scholars underscore today, the very local Jewish origins of Christianity. Julian rebuked Christians for abandoning their Hellenic traditions while at the same time not being faithful to Judaism. He blamed them for their veneration of martyrs, which is something not authorized in the New Testament. He compared the majesty and complexity of Plato's creation account with the clumsy and contradictory creation stories of Genesis 1 and 2. Julian composed his Against the Galileans in Antioch only several months before he died. The Christians ensured that this treatise did not survive, except when quoted by Bishop Cyril of Alexandria 2 generations after Julian had died. Despite his policy of nonviolence, Christians despised Julian. He filled them with existential dread. First, because it looked terrible that a former Christian, one of their own, had renewed the ancient cults and had reopened the temples. Second, because they despised these temples as the houses of demons. Third, because they lost their privileged status as the state-funded cult. Christian clergy were no longer tax-exempt. They no longer received government stipends. They were no longer exempt from serving on city councils, which was expensive. The Christian clergy who tried to dodge their civic duties were heavily fined. Christian zealots who were convicted of demolishing temples or of destroying cult statues in the previous years were ordered to rebuild them or to pay for their rebuilding, and those who refused were held in custody. At the same time, Julian also ordered a Catholic bishop to rebuild the Church of the Novatians, which he had destroyed. The Novatians were a competing sect of Christians at this time. It's true that some Hellenes used the reign of Julian as an excuse to perform mob violence against Christian zealots who had harmed them in the past. And Julian bears some responsibility because he didn't sufficiently punish these acts of mob violence. But Julian strongly condemned extrajudicial violence, and he exhorted everyone, whether Christian or not, to appeal to him. As a general policy, Julian refused to make martyrs. He beheaded Artemius, a military commander in Alexandria, but not for his Christian faith specifically. Artemius was killed for maladministration and for the destruction of public property. Artemius had destroyed cult statues and had stripped the temple of Serapis of its ornaments and dedicated gifts. Christians seized on the story, claiming that Artemius was killed because he was a Christian. In the 9th century, Christian writers would compose fake court documents showing Julian himself as the judge who engaged in long and bitter debates with Artemius. Near Antioch, Julian's half-brother Gallus had built a church opposite to the temple of Apollo at Daphne. The remains of a martyr named Babylas were transferred to this new shrine. Julian, for his part, wanted to consult Apollo of Daphne by the prophetic waters of the Castalian spring, but the god would not answer any of his questions. Julian concluded that the bones of the martyr were prohibiting Apollo from telling the future, the bones being a pollution for the god. Thus, Julian ordered the Christians to transfer the coffin back to the cemetery. And the Christians, for their part, made the transfer into a huge parade in which they loudly sang psalms in order to humiliate Julian. So, against his better judgment, Julian ordered that at least one of these singers be arrested. This man, called Theodore, was tortured as a rabble rouser and a disruptor of the public peace, but Julian quickly released him and returned to his policy of nonviolence. Instead of using the sword against Christians, he made a conscious choice to use the pen. A later Christian author admits that after the bones of Babylos were removed from Apollo's presence, the god did indeed begin to speak again, and Julian obtained his oracle of the future. But shortly thereafter, a fire of unknown causes completely torched Apollo's temple and melted the priceless gold and ivory statue. This was a loss of World Heritage proportions. This enormous statue had been made centuries earlier. It showed Apollo crowned with laurel, draped in a golden tunic, and holding a massive lyre. His perfect nude body was coated in ivory, his hair was plated with gold, and his eyes were two enormous violet gems. When Hellenes rushed to accuse the Christians of arson, Julian did nothing more than close the largest church in Antioch while an investigation went forward. No arsonists were ever found, and the Christians attributed the fire to lightning. The church was reopened, but its gold vessels, which had been donated by the previous emperor, were removed. Julian tolerated all religions, including Christianity, but he did make one official move against Christians, which they considered to be persecution. That is, he prohibited Christian teachers from teaching the classics in primary school and in the schools of rhetoric and philosophy. Now, it's hard for democratically minded people to understand this executive order, but Julian explains his motives in his Epistle 36, quote, "I hold that true education results in a healthy condition of mind, one that has true thoughts and opinions about things good and evil, noble and base. So whoever thinks one thing and teaches students another, then in my view, he fails to educate to the same extent that he fails to be an honest person." In other words, it didn't make sense to Julian that a person would teach about the Hellenic gods in Homer and Hesiod and then profess that these gods were, at best, myths and fictions, and at worst, deceiving demons. This practice seemed dishonest and frankly greedy, since Christian teachers made their money from teaching literature that they considered to be lies, at least theologically. Now, since dishonesty was a moral fault and teachers ought not to have moral faults, then teachers of the classics ought not to be those who despise the gods. Julian here frames the issue as a moral one, but of course he had primarily religious motivations, as he says, quote, "I think it's absurd that men who expound the works of these writers should dishonor the gods whom they used to worship," unquote. As a result of Julian's edict, Christian teachers and intellectuals everywhere were white hot with rage. Many lost their jobs, but Julian secured this advantage, that all young boys and girls, whether Christian or not, would be taught by Hellenes who truly believed the poets, or who were at least willing to allegorize them. This was Julian's strongest medicine against Christianity, to re-educate the youth. Despite his edict on education, Julian believed that the best way to control Christianity was not to openly punish Christians, but to let competing Christians cannibalize each other. In the generation before Julian's reign, Catholic Christians had clashed in an enormous and vitriolic debate about the divine nature of Christ. They simply could not agree about whether he was of the same substance of the Father, a completely different substance, or something very like the Father's substance. Creeds and counter-creeds were composed and councils were convened year after year. Disputing bishops and teachers lost their reputations, their homes, and sometimes their very lives. The Hellenic historian Ammianus observed that no wild beasts are as dangerous to humans as one Christian is to another. Knowing this, Julian decided to let the Christians loose on each other by bringing home from exile every Christian who had been exiled for their religious beliefs. He put no restrictions on other kinds of Christians, allowing all sorts of Christian denominations to flourish, just as in modern times. So all of a sudden, the Marcionites were back, as were the Valentinians, the Manichaeans, the Novatians, the Arians, the Semi-Arians, the Meletians. the Donatists, and every other Christian splinter group, including the supporters of the Nicene Creed. Julian never promoted any particular Christian group, but he did defend Christians who had been attacked by other Christians. For instance, he punished the Arian Christians in Edessa who attacked the local Valentinian church. He didn't arrest the Arians, but he heavily fined them. As he joked in a letter, he was helping these Christians obey Jesus' command to embrace poverty. Julian had observed that Christians make most of their converts not because they theologically convince people, but because they feed the poor and they care for the sick. For Julian, the obvious solution was to imitate Christian charity while renouncing their beliefs. So he encouraged the building of hospitals, and he donated food to Hellenic high priests who would in turn distribute it to the poor. Julian wrote that we ought to share our money with all people, but more generously with the good and with the helpless and the poor so as to suffice for their need. It would be an act dear to the gods to share our clothes and our food even with the wicked. As Pontifex Maximus, or supreme priest, Julian felt he had a mission. For Constantine, that mission was to establish Christianity. For Julian, it was to establish Hellenism as a unified religion. But to do so, Julian had to reinvent Hellenism. Julian aimed to make Hellenism a cohesive force, but he had to impose a vision and a storyline from the top down. Hellenism just wasn't a unified system or religion. It was a mishmash of local and indigenous rites and beliefs. Using mainly Neoplatonic philosophy, Julian tried to construct a coherent theology that would reveal the unified truth behind all rites and sacred stories. We see his own first attempts at creating this kind of theology in his treatises on the Mother of the Gods and the Hymn to King Helios. I recommend, of course, that everyone go read these treatises. They are in the Loeb Classical Library. But I consider them to be very preliminary. Remember that Julian was only about 31 years old when he wrote them. He was just beginning his career as an intellectual. The emperor may have meant these treatises to be read by a greater public, and he did his best to simplify complex Neoplatonic theology. Nevertheless, the treatises remain challenging, and they probably would not have meant very much outside of intellectual circles. If Julian had reigned longer, he may have come up with a simplified Hellenic creed to which any follower of Attis or of Mithras could ascribe, but he died before he could implement anything like a coherent set of religious reforms. One of the interesting things about these treatises is Julian's apparent borrowing from Christian theology. He probably believed that Christians had borrowed and adapted everything from Hellenic and Platonic theology, so Julian, in effect, reborrowed ideas in an act that we might call counter-syncretism. Specifically, Julian portrayed figures like Dionysus and Attis in ways that Christians depicted the Logos creator of this world. Both Attis and Dionysus are like the Logos in that they are lower creators facing the material world who bestow life on all things and who govern the lower creation. In effect, Christians borrowed the idea of the Logos from Greek philosophy, and Julian in turn adapted the Christian notion to gods in his theological system. To sum up, in terms of the politics of religion, Julian was actually a lot like his uncle Constantine. He was a theocrat who tried to establish a Hellenic theocracy, a creedalized or formalized Hellenism with a central mythology and a hierarchy of high priests. He wasn't democratic. He didn't believe in the freedom of speech or of religion, and he didn't consider these things to be fundamental human rights. Unlike his predecessors, he did not engage in political violence against Christians, although it was certainly clear that he favored Hellenes for political appointments, and he had some very strident remarks against Christians in his decrees. Moreover, Julian tried to control the educational system, and it's worthwhile understanding why he did so. He did really think that Christianity was hurting the empire, like a disease hurts the human body. And as a supreme priest, he viewed himself as a doctor for the soul. A doctor doesn't just let the patient suffer, even if the patient rejects treatment and refuses to swallow the medicine. As Libanius the orator put it, Julian tried to win his Christian opponents by persuasion and refused the use of force. Those who could be cured, he began to direct toward the truth, but he would not drag by main force those wedded to the baser way of life. For all that, he never ceased to exclaim, "Don't you see that you're sick, like the impious giants? It was their contempt for the gods, just like yours, that gave rise to the story." Julian was aware, Libanius said, that a person who takes thought for worship will have care for the goods of the soul more than for anything else, and piety is the first of those goods. If Julian had given away all his wealth to people, but did not mend their theological errors, he would be behaving like a doctor who healed a patient sick in every body part, all except for the eyes. And frankly, Julian was moderately successful in getting many politicians and orators, at least, to change from Christianity to Hellenism. Libanius here again testifies that Julian proceeded first to the cure of their souls, leading men to the recognition of the real lords of heaven, and regarding those so instructed as closer to him than kinsmen. The friend of Zeus was his friend, but not every man who was not yet a friend of Zeus was his foe, for he did not rebuff those he thought he could convert in time, and by the charms he exercised on them, he began to lead them on, and despite their initial reluctance, he revealed them later congregating around the altars. If Julian had reigned for 30 plus years like his uncle Constantine, he would doubtless have had a much greater effect, and the Roman Empire may never have become Christian. As a modern historian, however, I don't think it's helpful to idealize Julian, even if you're on his side, as it were. Although, of course, his policies were in general nonviolent, he didn't believe in the democratic value of religious freedom. And as a man of my time, I must confess that I don't think that any particular system or religion ought to be established or favored in any way. By favoring Hellenism and by trying to establish it, Julian was as far from the Enlightenment values as was Constantine. Julian's policies ensured a counter-response among later Christian emperors who actually did not keep to the path of nonviolence after Julian unexpectedly died in Persia. Needless to say, Christian emperors were a lot more careful from that point on never to allow one of their number to embrace the old gods. What remains of these gods lies mostly embedded in the vast body of Christianity itself.